Clara Whitmore did not weep at her wedding. She stood straight, gloves folded at her wrists, while Nathaniel Ashford signed the marriage register without once looking at her face. Then he turned and walked out the church door before the ink dried. The carriage that took her away did not go to his Boston house. It carried her north toward a locked estate no one had lived in for 7 years. She pressed her hand flat against the cold carriage window and made herself one promise: I will not disappear for anyone. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Carriage rolled through the iron gate at 4:30 in the afternoon, and Clara Whitmore did not flinch when she saw what waited for her. Ashford Hollow sat at the end of a long gravel drive, flanked by overgrown oaks, whose branches had grown so thick across each other they nearly blocked the sky. The house itself was 3 stories of dark brick and shuttered windows, every one of them sealed tight, as if the house had decided long ago that it wanted no more light. The front steps were cracked. The brass door knocker had gone green. A loose shutter on the second floor swung once in the warm July wind, and the sound it made, that hollow wooden clap against the frame, was the only greeting she received. The coachman lifted her trunk from the roof and set it on the gravel without ceremony. "Mr. Ashford's instructions," he said, handing her a sealed letter, "were that Mrs. Reed will receive you." Then he climbed back onto the box and drove away. Clara stood alone on the gravel with one trunk and a letter from a man who had already demonstrated clearly and efficiently exactly what he thought of her. She broke the wax seal. The letter was brief. 3 sentences. "Mrs. Ashford. Ashford Hollow is at your disposal. Mrs. Reed will show you the household accounts. I will be in Boston until further notice." No signature, not even his initial. Clara folded the letter, slid it into her coat pocket, and picked up her own trunk. She was still holding it when the front door finally opened. The woman who appeared was perhaps 60, small-framed, with iron-gray hair pulled back severely, and eyes that catalogued Clara from hem to hat brim in roughly 4 seconds. "Mrs. Ashford," the woman said. Her tone made it sound like a question she hadn't decided whether to ask. "Mrs. Reed," Clara replied. "I believe you were expecting me." "I was told to expect you." There was a difference in those 2 things, and Mrs. Reed's expression made certain Clara understood it. "Come in then. Mind the second step it gives." Clara minded the second step. The inside of Ashford Hollow was dark in the way that old grief is dark. Not absence of light exactly, but a heaviness that had settled so long it had become part of the walls. Holland covers draped over most of the furniture in the main parlor. A grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped at 11:20, and nobody had seen fit to wind it. Dust lay across the mantel shelf in a layer thick enough to write your name in, and Clara suspected that if she tried, she would find names already there, written by other hands in other seasons and never wiped clean. "The household staff," Mrs. Reed said, moving through the hallway with the efficient step of a woman who had long since made peace with an unpleasant assignment, "consists of myself, Samuel the groundskeeper's boy, Dora who manages the kitchen, and William who sees to the horses. That is all. That is all for this size of house." Mr. Ashford did not see a need for more. Clara looked up the main staircase. The banister was solid walnut, beautiful work, but a section of carpet on the 3rd step had pulled loose from its rod, and nobody had tacked it back down. "How long has the house been in this condition?" Clara asked. Mrs. Reed's jaw tightened slightly. "The house has been maintained within Mr. Ashford's stated requirements." "I'm not criticizing Mrs. Reed. I'm asking a question." A pause. Then, 7 years. Since Mrs. Ashford the first. Mrs. Ashford passed. 7 years. Clara looked at the stopped clock again. 11:20. She wondered what had happened at 11:20, and whether Nathaniel Ashford even remembered that he had left the clock at that hour, or whether he'd simply stopped looking at it the same day he'd stopped looking at everything else. "I would like to see the household accounts," Clara said. "This evening, if you can manage it." Mrs. Reed looked faintly surprised. "You want to see the accounts?" "Mr. Ashford's letter mentioned them. I'd like to understand what I've been given responsibility over." "Most women in your situation would want to see their rooms first." "I'll see my rooms too," Clara said. "But accounts first." Her rooms were on the second floor, east-facing, which meant they would catch the morning light if anyone ever opened the shutters. No one had. The bedroom was clean enough. Mrs. Reed kept a clean house, whatever else might be said, but it felt provisional. The bed was made with plain white linen. There was a writing desk with no paper on it, a fireplace that had not been laid, a wardrobe with bare shelves. There was no vanity mirror. Clara set her trunk down, opened it herself, and began unpacking. She had 4 dresses, 2 dishes, her sewing kit, her mother's Bible, a small leather journal that she'd been writing in since she was 16, and a folded piece of paper on which she'd copied out the Massachusetts statutes governing married women's property rights. She kept that page. She always kept that page. She hung her dresses in the wardrobe. She placed the Bible on the nightstand. She set the journal and the folded statutes side by side on the writing desk, then stood back and looked at the room. "All right," she said quietly to no one. "Let's begin." She ate dinner alone in the kitchen that first night because the formal dining room had been shut for so long. Mrs. Reed looked genuinely alarmed when Clara suggested opening it. "Mr. Ashford doesn't—" "Mr. Ashford isn't here," Clara said, not unkindly. "I'll eat in the kitchen tonight, but I'd like the dining room opened by the end of the week." Mrs. Reed stared at her. "I know this isn't what you expected," Clara said. She sat down at the kitchen work table and accepted the bowl of soup Dora placed in front of her with a nod of thanks that made Dora blink. "You expected a woman who'd spend a week crying and then go back to wherever she came from. I understand that. I might have expected the same thing. And yet here you are," Mrs. Reed said. "And yet here I am." Clara lifted her spoon. "The accounts after supper, Mrs. Reed. I mean it." The household accounts were a portrait of slow strangulation. Clara sat at the kitchen table with 3 ledger books spread open under the lamp, and she read every entry twice. Mrs. Reed sat across from her, arms folded, watching with an expression that had shifted somewhere in the past hour, from suspicion into something more carefully neutral. The numbers told a story. Not a complete one. Too many pages had been carefully maintained at the surface level, showing proper expenditures for a house this size, but there were threads. Payments to suppliers in Boston that ran 15% higher than comparable expenses. A quarterly estate management fee paid to a firm called Heiress and Associates that Clara could find no signed contract for anywhere in the books. Timber sales from the North acreage that showed far lower receipts than current Massachusetts market prices would explain. "Mrs. Reed," Clara said, not looking up from the ledger. "How long has Heiress and Associates been collecting this management fee?" Silence. Clara looked up. Mrs. Reed's expression had gone very still. 4 years near enough. "Who authorized it?" "It was in place when I arrived. I assumed Mr. Ashford." "Did you ever see a contract?" Another silence. Longer. "No." Clara looked back at the numbers. 4 years of quarterly payments, never questioned, never contracted. She pulled her journal toward her and began copying the figures in her careful, precise hand. "I'm not accusing anyone in this house," Clara said. "I want you to understand that. Whatever is happening here happened before you, and likely before anyone who's left in this household." "But you think something is happening." "I think," Clara said, closing the first ledger and opening the second, "that someone has been very patient and very quiet and very confident that no one would ever look too closely at this estate." She wrote another number. Then she looked at Mrs. Reed directly. "They miscalculated." Word that Nathaniel Ashford had taken a new wife arrived in Boston society roughly 4 hours after the wedding, which is to say, before Clara's carriage had even reached the county road north. By the end of the first week, the story had been embroidered considerably in the version circulating through the better drawing rooms on Beacon Hill. Nathaniel Ashford had been practically coerced into the marriage by old creditor pressure from the Whitmore family name, the same name that had once been respectable before old Daniel Whitmore had managed to lose nearly everything in a shipping venture gone wrong. The new Mrs. Ashford was described as plain desperate, 26 years old, with no prospects, who had apparently clung to the Ashford connection with both hands, because she had nothing else left to hold on to. Vivian Harrow told this version best. She had a gift for stories for trimming them just so, smoothing out the parts that might generate sympathy and sharpening the parts that generated contempt. She told it over tea with her particular brand of bright, sorrowful candor, the kind that makes the listener feel they are being confided in rather than poisoned. Of course, Nathaniel felt some obligation, Vivian said, setting down her teacup. Her father and his did business together years ago. It was a kindness, really. He's given her a house and a title, and she ought to be grateful. Though I understand she's already making a nuisance of herself up at Hollow. The housekeeper wrote to say she's going through ledgers. Ledgers. A small musical laugh. What would a woman like that know about estate accounts? Across the table, her cousin nodded along. Vivian reached for another biscuit and smiled at the window. She had been confident from the moment she heard the name Whitmore that this would all resolve itself within a month. The girl would find the isolation intolerable and retreat. Nathaniel would come to his senses. Things would return to the arrangement they had been building toward for 3 years before his inconvenient conscience had intervened. She was not worried. She simply kept watch. Clara had been at Ashford Hollow 11 days when she found the garden. Not that the garden was hidden. It sat behind the house in full view. But it had been so completely reclaimed by 7 years of untended growth that it was easy to mistake it for simply more wilderness. Clara only found its boundaries because she was walking the north fence line, trying to understand the property's acreage, and she stepped through a gap in an overgrown privet hedge and found herself standing in the middle of what had once been a formal kitchen garden. Stone paths still there beneath the weeds. A central well choked with climbing vine. Raised herb. She could see the old edging stones buried under grass and thistle. Against the south wall, a row of what had been espaliered apple trees, now grown wild and graceless, their trained branches long gone to tangle. Clara stood very still in the middle of it. Then she heard footsteps on gravel, and Samuel appeared around the hedge. A boy of about 17, broad-shouldered and uncomfortable with conversation, who had been following her at a respectful distance for the past half hour without once announcing himself. "You knew this was here," Clara said. Samuel looked at his boots. "Yes, ma'am." "Why didn't anyone tend it?" A pause. "Mr. Ashford said to leave it." Clara looked at the apple trees. They were still alive. She could see new growth in the tangle green and persistent fighting through the chaos of neglect. 7 years, and they were still fighting. "Samuel," she said. "Ma'am." "Do you know how to prune?" He looked up. "My father taught me. Before he stopped." "Yes, ma'am. I know how." "Good." Clara pushed up her sleeves. "Then we have work to do." By the end of the second week, the east parlor was open. The Holland covers had come off, the windows had been unlatched and thrown wide to let in the July heat and the smell of grass, and Dora had beaten the rugs until the dust came out in clouds. Mrs. Reed had watched the process with the expression of a woman who had decided to suspend judgment until she had more evidence. The evidence was accumulating. Clara did not sleep past 6. She rose before the household dressed without assistance, and was at the kitchen table with her journal and ledger copies before Dora had the first fire lit. She learned the names of every servant within 3 days. She asked Samuel about the condition of the roof, the state of the well water, the year the north fence had last been reposted. She asked Dora about the kitchen accounts and whether there was a reliable supplier in the nearest town. She asked William about the horses, and whether the carriage axle that rode rough on the right side had been looked at recently. William said he hadn't had money in the repair budget to see to it. Clara wrote that down. She wrote everything down. Then, one morning, near the end of the second week, Mrs. Reed came to the kitchen at 6:30 and found Clara already there, and instead of going to the opposite end of the table and sitting with her arms folded, Mrs. Reed pulled out the chair across from Clara and sat down and said, "The dining room curtains are salvageable if we take them down and beat them properly. I wanted you to know." Clara looked at her over the top of the ledger. "Thank you, Mrs. Reed." A long pause. "The missing funds," Mrs. Reed said. "I've been thinking about it. There's something else you should see." She placed a folded document on the table between them. Clara unfolded it. It was a letter 3 years old, written on Harrow and Associates stationery, addressed to a property agent in Boston, discussing the potential acquisition of the north acreage of an estate in rural Massachusetts, whose current owner was described as disengaged from management. The estate was Ashford Hollow. The disengaged owner was Nathaniel Ashford. Clara read it twice. Then she placed it carefully flat on the table and pressed both hands on it as if to hold it still. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "Back of the linen cupboard," Mrs. Reed said. "Behind the Christmas tablecloths. I don't know how it got there. I don't know if Mr. Ashford ever saw it, but I know what it means. It means someone has been planning to take this estate," Clara said. "Not steal it outright, drain it slowly, undervalue it, document it as a failing property, and then purchase it when the owner finally lets go." "Yes," Mrs. Reed said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the early morning light. "He's not going to let go," Clara said. Mrs. Reed blinked. "Mr. Ashford. He married me and sent me here and walked away from the whole thing because he doesn't know what he has left worth keeping." Clara folded the letter and placed it in her journal between the pages of property statutes. "Someone has been counting on that. Someone has been very carefully making sure he stays away and stays disengaged and never looks too closely at these numbers." She closed the journal. "I looked closely," she said, "and I intend to keep looking." The letter from Boston arrived on the 19th day. It was not from Nathaniel. It was addressed to the current occupant Ashford Hollow, which told Clara everything she needed to know about who had sent it. She broke the seal anyway. The letter was from a woman named Vivian Harrow. The handwriting was elegant. The tone was gracious in the way that a blade is gracious, sharp and precise, and intended to enter cleanly. "Dear Mrs. Ashford, I hope you are finding the country air restorative. I understand Ashford Hollow can be quite rustic for those unaccustomed to rural Massachusetts. I write only to introduce myself, as I have been a close friend to the Ashford family for many years, and would not wish there to be any awkwardness between us. Should you have need of guidance regarding Boston society, or the Ashford name's proper social obligations, I am always available to advise. I do hope you will consider the wisdom of discretion in all matters pertaining to the estate. Some things are better left to those with longer familiarity with the family's affairs. With warmest regards, Miss Vivian Harrow." Clara read it to the end. Then she set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment. "Dora," she said. The cook looked over from the stove. "Do we have good writing paper?" "Yes, ma'am. In the desk in the east parlor. You had me find it last week." "Good." Clara folded Vivian Harrow's letter and placed it in the journal next to the property acquisition letter and the copied ledger figures. She was building something page by page and number by number, and she could feel it taking shape. "I won't be needing it today, but soon." She opened the garden ledger and went back to work. The 28th apple tree had survived. She'd counted them that morning, 28 trees along the south wall. Every single one, still alive, still reaching, still pressing new growth through 7 years of being left behind. Clara wrote that down too. Some things refused to give up. She intended to be one of them. The 31st morning at Ashford Hollow began the same way the previous 30 had, Clara at the kitchen table before sunrise, ledger open, journal beside it. Dora's fire crackling to life in the stove, while the rest of the house still slept. But something had shifted overnight, and Clara felt it the moment she opened the North Acreage accounts again. She had been adding the timber receipts column 3 different ways for 4 days, and every time she arrived at the same number. The receipts logged for the past 3 years showed sales of approximately 40 cords of hardwood annually from the North Acreage. 40 cords at current Massachusetts market rates should have produced a specific amount. What had actually been deposited into the Ashford Hollow operating account was less than half that figure. The difference, season after season, year after year, had gone somewhere. And that somewhere had a name printed neatly at the top of a property acquisition letter currently tucked inside Clara's journal. She wrote the final sum at the bottom of the column, underlined it twice, and set down her pen. "Dora," she said. Dora looked up from the bread she was working. When Harrow and Associates sends their quarterly invoice, what form does it come in? A letter A formal bill. Dora wiped her hands on her apron. Come in a sealed envelope, ma'am. Addressed to the estate account, not to Mr. Ashford personal. Always has. And who opens estate account correspondence? Mrs. Reed mostly, sometimes me if she's occupied. Has Mr. Ashford ever opened one himself? Dora thought about it. Genuinely thought, not just performed consideration. Not that I ever saw, ma'am. He hasn't been here for the quarterly billing in... She stopped. In a long time. Clara picked up her pen again and wrote, correspondence routed away from principal. 4 years minimum. She capped the pen. Someone had built this very carefully. The kind of careful that assumes it will never be examined. She was examining it. By the 5th week the dining room was open. Mrs. Reed had taken down the curtains herself, something Clara had not asked her to do, had not even hinted at, and had them beaten and rehung within a single afternoon. The table had been cleared of the holland cloth that had covered it, and it was a beautiful table, long and well made in dark cherry wood, with inlaid banding at each end that somebody had once taken genuine pride in choosing. Clara ran her hand along the surface the first morning she walked in and found the room usable. This was a fine house once, she said, not to anyone in particular. Samuel was in the doorway, waiting for instructions about the garden. My father said it used to be the best house in 3 counties, when the first Mrs. Ashford was alive. Clara looked at the table. What was she like? Samuel was quiet for a moment. He was a boy who chose his words carefully, which Clara had come to respect considerably. Kind, he said finally. She knew every plant in that garden by name. She used to bring cut herbs into the kitchen herself, not send a servant for them. She tended the garden. Every morning, Mr. Ashford used to stand at the back window and watch her. He stopped as if he'd said too much. That's just what my father told me. I was small. Clara looked at the south window that faced the garden. Go start on the 2nd apple row, she said. I'll be out shortly. The letter she wrote to Judge Elias Monroe took her 3 drafts. The first was too formal. The kind of language that put men on the defensive before they'd finished the first paragraph. The second was too deferential, the kind of language that made men assume the writer needed assistance, rather than information. The third she wrote the way her father had taught her to write, when they still had enough money for him to be teaching her anything, plainly, specifically, and with every important fact presented before the request, so that the request itself appeared not as a petition, but as an obvious logical conclusion. Dear Judge Monroe, I am writing in my capacity as Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford, having recently assumed management of Ashford Hollow Estate in rural Massachusetts. In reviewing the household accounts, I have identified several irregularities which I believe require legal clarification. These include a quarterly management fee paid to Harrow and Associates for a period of no less than 4 years, for which I can locate no executed contract in the estate records, and timber sale receipts, which appear significantly below current market value for the volume documented. I am also in possession of a letter dated 3 years prior from Harrow and Associates to a Boston property agent discussing the potential acquisition of land, which is currently part of this estate. I would be grateful for your guidance regarding the proper legal procedures for investigating potential mismanagement of estate funds under Massachusetts statute and any protections available to the estate principal. I remain yours respectfully. Clara Ashford, née Whitmore. She sealed it herself. She gave it to William to post. She did not tell Mrs. Reed. William came back from town with the post 3 days later and set a small stack of correspondence on the kitchen table beside Clara's morning coffee without comment. He had over the past 5 weeks adopted the habit of non-comment in relation to Mrs. Ashford's activities, which Clara found deeply useful. The stack contained 2 things of interest. The first was a brief response from Judge Monroe's office, not from the judge himself, but from his clerk acknowledging receipt of her letter and advising that Judge Monroe would be available to meet at his Boston office at her convenience, and that the matters she had described were in the clerk's carefully chosen language, worthy of review. Clara read that twice and set it aside. The second was a letter from Boston that she recognized by the handwriting before she broke the seal. She'd only seen it once, but Vivian Harrow's hand was the kind of precise, deliberate script that a person developed by practicing it, which told you something about the writer already. This letter was shorter than the first. Dear Mrs. Ashford, I hear you have been making changes at Ashford Hollow. How industrious. I do hope you are keeping Nathaniel informed of your activities. He is particular about his estates, as those who know him well understand. I would not want any enthusiasm on your part to create complications between you. With continued warmth, Miss Vivian Harrow. Clara set that letter on the table too. She placed it next to the clerk's response from Judge Monroe's office and looked at both of them, threat and leverage, sitting 3 inches apart on her kitchen table. Dora, she said. Ma'am. Is there more coffee? Just brewed. Thank you. She filed Vivian's letter in the journal with the others and went back to the accounts. The first real test came on a Tuesday in early August when a man named Gerald Pratt arrived at the front door. He was 40-ish, well-dressed in the Boston merchant style, and he carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who had never in his adult life been told no by anyone he considered worth hearing it from. He gave William his card without looking at him. He asked for Mr. Ashford. When William said Mr. Ashford was not in residence, Pratt asked for the estate agent. When William said there was no estate agent currently in residence, Pratt paused and then said with the air of a man improvising a minor inconvenience that he would then speak to whoever was managing the property. Clara received him in the east parlor standing. She did not invite him to sit. Pratt looked around the open, cleaned room, the uncovered furniture, the open windows, the fresh arrangement of garden herbs in a clay pot on the side table, with the expression of a man recalibrating his expectations. Mrs. Ashford, he said, I represent Harrow and Associates. I know who you represent, Mr. Pratt. A brief pause. Then you'll understand the nature of my visit. We manage several interests connected to this estate, and it's come to our attention that there may be some confusion regarding the accounting records. There's no confusion, Clara said. The accounts are quite clear. Pratt smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been trained to smile at difficult women as a technique for reducing them. I think perhaps with a fresh set of eyes, some of the figures can look irregular, when in fact, Mr. Pratt. Clara's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. I've copied every ledger entry dating back 4 years. I've documented the discrepancy between the timber receipts and current Massachusetts market rates. I've identified the quarterly management fees and noted the absence of any executed contract authorizing them. And I've been in correspondence with Judge Elias Monroe's office regarding the proper legal procedures for reviewing potential estate mismanagement. Pratt's smile did not disappear, but something behind it did. Judge Monroe, he said. Judge Monroe, she confirmed. A longer pause. Mrs. Ashford, I think it would be prudent for you to speak with your husband before taking any actions that could complicate the estate's established relationships. My husband sent me here to manage this household, Clara said. I am managing it. If Harrow and Associates has a legitimate contract with this estate, I'll expect a copy delivered here within the week. If no contract exists, the quarterly payments will cease effective immediately, and Judge Monroe will receive a full account of the discrepancies. Pratt looked at her for a long moment. He was reassessing her. She could see it reassembling his understanding of who he was dealing with. The calculation behind his eyes was not hostile exactly, but it was cold, and she recognized it for what it was. The calculation of a man who had just realized this was going to be harder than he'd planned. I'll relay your position to my principals, he said. Please do. She did not see him out. William showed him to the door. Mrs. Reed appeared in the parlor doorway approximately 4 seconds after the front door closed. I was in the hall, she said by way of explanation. I know, Clara said. He came from Harrow. Yes. Mrs. Reed crossed her arms. Then she uncrossed them. What will they do next? Something faster than they've been moving, Clara said. They've been patient for 4 years because no one was looking. Now someone is looking, and patience is going to start costing them more than they budgeted for. She went back to the east parlor desk and picked up her pen. "Mrs. Reed," she said, not turning around. "Ma'am." "Make sure the front door is locked at night from now on. All the windows on the ground floor, too." A pause. "Yes, ma'am," Mrs. Reed said, and for the first time, the title did not sound like a question. It was Samuel who found it. He came to Clara in the garden on a Thursday afternoon, moving faster than his usual deliberate pace, and she knew before he spoke that something had changed. "Ma'am," he said, "the north fence." "What about it?" "3 posts pulled, not fallen pulled. Stakes are gone too, the section that borders the acreage line." Clara set down the pruning shears. "Show me." She followed him to the north boundary, and she saw exactly what he meant. 3 fence posts that had been standing 2 days prior. She had walked that line herself. She knew their positions were gone. Not rotted through, not storm damaged. The ground around the holes was disturbed in the specific way that ground is disturbed when something is extracted deliberately. "Who's been on this property?" she asked. "Nobody I've seen. But I wasn't watching the north line every hour." Clara looked at the gap in the fence. Beyond it, the timber acreage stretched away into summer green. The trees were old growth in sections, hardwood stands worth considerably more than the receipts in the ledger had ever suggested. "Someone wants this line to look disputed," she said almost to herself. "Ma'am, if the fence posts are missing, the boundary becomes harder to prove without survey records. And if the boundary is disputed—" She stopped. "Samuel, where are the original property survey documents for this estate?" He stared at her. "I don't know, ma'am. Ask Mrs. Reed tonight. Don't ask tomorrow tonight." She pulled a measuring cord from her work apron pocket and began marking the position of the missing posts with stones pulled from the field edge, noting each measurement against a rough sketch she made in her journal on the spot. If someone wanted this line to look uncertain, she was going to make certain it looked like anything but. The survey documents were in the house. Mrs. Reed found them in a chest in the library, a room Clara had not yet fully opened, which now felt like a mistake inside a locked box, whose key was on a ring with 6 others hanging in the back of the estate key cabinet. The documents were original, signed, stamped, dated 1797, clearly establishing every boundary of Ashford Hollow's 240 acres, including the north timber acreage in specific and unmistakable terms. Clara spread them on the library table and read them twice in their entirety. Then she rolled them carefully, wrapped them in oilcloth, and put them in the chest in her bedroom. "Does anyone else know these were here?" she asked Mrs. Reed. "I knew where they were kept. I don't know who else did. From now on, they're in my room." Clara turned the library lamp up. "Mrs. Reed, I need you to think carefully. Over the past 4 years, have there been any visitors to the estate, anyone representing Harrow or Associates, anyone claiming to inspect the property, any stranger with a legitimate-sounding reason to be inside this house?" Mrs. Reed thought carefully. It was one of the things Clara had come to rely on about her. The woman was not one for quick, comfortable answers. "2 years ago," she said slowly. "A man who said he was from the county assessor's office. He came to review the property records. I let him into the library." "Did he leave with anything?" "Nothing I saw him take." A pause. "But he was in the room alone for nearly half an hour." Clara looked at the empty space on the chest's interior, where the oilcloth survey roll had lived untouched for 7 years. "He would have found them," she said. "He would have known exactly where they were and what they contained. He just didn't take them, because taking them would have been noticed. He only needed to know they existed." She closed the chest, locked it, put the key on the chain around her neck. "No one enters this library without me present," she said, "not for any reason." 3 days later, the reply came from Harrow and Associates, not through Pratt, this time. Through the post. A legal-sized envelope, very proper, very correct, containing a single page that informed Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford that Harrow and Associates had been managing certain interests of the Ashford estate for a period of 4 years under a verbal agreement with Mr. Ashford himself, and that should she have any questions regarding this arrangement, they respectfully suggested she direct her inquiries to her husband, as any alterations to existing estate management arrangements would require his written authorization. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table, while Dora made breakfast and Mrs. Reed sat across from her waiting. "Verbal agreement," Clara said. "That's what it says," Mrs. Reed confirmed. "No signatures, no documentation, 4 years of payments for a verbal agreement." Clara set the letter down. "That's not a contract, that's a story. They're saying you can't do anything without Nathaniel's written word. They're betting he won't give it." Clara folded the letter. "They've been managing him for 4 years by keeping him away and keeping him uninterested. They assume he'll stay that way." She stood up. "I need to write to him," she said. Mrs. Reed looked startled. "To Mr. Ashford?" "Yes." Clara was already moving toward the east parlor. "I've avoided it because I didn't want to seem like I was asking for rescue. I'm not asking for rescue. I'm telling him what's happening to his estate and giving him the opportunity to act on it. That's not the same thing." She sat at the desk and pulled out clean paper. "There's a difference," she said mostly to herself, "between needing a man to save you and choosing to tell him the truth." She wrote the letter in one draft. She sealed it herself. She gave it to William with instructions to ride to Boston directly. Then she went back to work. His response came faster than she expected. 4 days. A brief letter in a hand she had not seen before, direct. Unornamented, the handwriting of a man who wrote quickly and didn't think much about how the letters looked. "Mrs. Ashford, I have received your account of the estate records. I will be at Ashford Hollow within a fortnight. N. Ashford." Clara read it once, folded it, set it on the desk. "Well," she said. She was not certain how she felt. She had written the letter as a professional communication regarding estate concerns, and that was the frame she intended to hold. He was coming because of the estate. That was appropriate. That was correct. She had not written the letter because she wanted him to come. She told herself that clearly. She believed it almost entirely. But she found herself that afternoon in the garden asking Samuel to start on the south wall. Apple trees, the ones that were the furthest along, the ones already beginning to show what they would be once they had room to grow properly. She did not examine her reasons for that particular choice. She simply picked up the shears and went to work. And the house, which had been breathing steadily for over a month, now kept breathing, windows open, fires lit at evening, the smell of Dora's bread moving through the halls, the sound of Samuel's pruning work drifting in from the garden. Ashford Hollow was not transformed. It was not yet what it had been. But it was alive again in a way it had not been alive for 7 years. Clara stood at the east window in the early evening, looking at the south wall where the apple trees were beginning very slowly, with the particular stubbornness of things that have been neglected but not destroyed, to show their shape. 14 days. She had 14 days before Nathaniel Ashford walked through that door, and she intended to use every one of them. The 14th day arrived, the way significant days often do, without announcement, looking exactly like the 13 that came before it. Clara was in the garden when she heard the carriage on the gravel drive. She did not run inside to change her dress. She did not pull off her work gloves and smooth her hair and arrange herself into something more presentable. She finished tying the apple branch she was working on, secured the knot, and then walked through the garden gate and around the side of the house, at a pace that was neither hurried nor deliberately slow. Nathaniel Ashford was stepping down from the carriage. She had not looked at him closely at the wedding. There had been no reason to. He had made it abundantly clear that the ceremony was a formality to be endured, not a beginning to be marked. She had looked at his hands signing the register, and at the set of his jaw, and at the door he walked out of, and she had composed herself and followed her own path. She had not permitted herself a portrait of him. She was getting one now. How was taller than she remembered. Lean in the way of men who work physically, not desk lean, but rope and timber lean, the kind that comes from a man who does not leave all the labor to others. His coat was good quality, but not fussy. He carried no hat. His hair was dark, and he had the kind of face that had once been open and had then been closed by something, and had been closed long enough that the closing had become the default expression. He was looking at the house. He stood still for a long moment looking at it. Clara watched him look at it. She saw the He registered that the shutters were open. All of them. Every window on the front face of the house caught the afternoon light instead of blocking it. And the house. Her house, she had started thinking of it that way without entirely meaning to, looked like a house that had people in it. People who intended to stay. She saw something move across his face. She could not name it precisely. It was not pleasure, and it was not displeasure, and it was not the careful blankness he had worn at the church. It was something older than any of those things, and it passed quickly, and then he turned and saw her standing 15 feet away in a work dress with garden dirt on her gloves. They looked at each other. "Mr. Ashford," Clara said. "Mrs. Ashford." His voice was lower than she'd registered. He took her in the same way she'd taken him in, direct, thorough, without apology for the looking. "You're in the garden." "I was. I heard the carriage." She pulled off her work gloves. "I wasn't told to expect you today specifically." "My letter said a fortnight." "Your letter said within a fortnight. Today is the 14th day." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement. "Within and on are different things." "Generally, yes." She tucked the gloves into her apron pocket. "Mrs. Reed has your rooms prepared. William will see to your horse. Dora will have supper at 7 if that suits you." She said it the way a competent household manager says it, informatively, without warmth or coldness, as a statement of what the house was prepared to provide. Nathaniel looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the house again. "The shutters," he said. "They were sealed. I opened them." "I can see that." "The rooms needed light." She met his gaze directly. "If that was a mistake, you can tell me so plainly." He did not tell her it was a mistake. He did not say anything at all for a moment that stretched longer than comfort. Then he picked up his traveling case. He had not allowed William to take it, and walked toward the front steps. 7 o'clock, he said. 7 o'clock, Clara confirmed. She went back to the garden. Her hands were perfectly steady. Supper was the strangest meal Clara had eaten since arriving at Ashford Hollow, which was saying something because she had eaten some strange meals in the past 6 weeks. The dining room, now fully restored to function, curtains, rehung table, polished candles lit at both ends, looked the way it was meant to look. Mrs. Reed had outdone herself, or had instructed Dora to outdone herself, and the food was good roasted chicken, early corn from the kitchen garden bread that Dora made with the particular pride of a woman who knows she bakes better than most. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table. Clara sat at the opposite end. The distance between them was approximately 8 feet of cherry wood and 7 years of absence, and an entire architecture of things neither of them had said yet. He ate without commenting on the food. She ate without commenting on his silence. Then midway through the meal he set down his fork. "You said in your letter there were irregularities in the accounts," he said. "Yes." "How long have you been tracking them?" "Since the 3rd day I was here." He looked at her. "The 3rd day." "The household accounts were the first thing I asked to see. Something in the numbers didn't sit correctly. I've been working through it since." "And what did you find?" Clara set down her own fork. She had known this conversation was coming. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, methodically, with documentation, with enough specificity that she could not be dismissed as a woman who had misread a column or misunderstood a figure. "I found 4 years of quarterly payments to a firm called Heiress Associates, totaling a significant sum, with no executed contract anywhere in the estate records to authorize them." She kept her voice level. "I found timber sale receipts from the North Acreage that show proceeds at less than half the current Massachusetts market rate for the documented volume. I found a letter from Heiress and Associates to a Boston property agent discussing the potential acquisition of this estate's North Acreage, written 3 years ago, which was filed in the back of the linen cupboard. And last week I found the north fence boundary posts, pulled not fallen, pulled from 3 sections along the acreage line." Nathaniel was very still. "The survey documents," Clara continued, "were still in the library. I've secured them. I've also been in correspondence with Judge Monroe's office, who has confirmed the discrepancies are worthy of legal review." Silence. "You wrote to Monroe," Nathaniel said. "I needed to understand the legal protections available to the estate. I did not ask for his direct intervention. I asked for information." How did you know to contact Monroe? His name was on the original estate incorporation documents from 1797 filed with the county. He's the family's legal man of record. She picked up her fork again. I did read everything in that library, Mr. Ashford, all of it. Another silence different in texture from the first. Harrow, he said. The word came out flat and contained the way words come out when a man is working to keep a larger reaction behind them. Yes, Clara said. Vivian Harrow's family, her father's firm. She's been managing the social end, the letters, the rumors in Boston, the public framing of your marriage as a charity arrangement. Her family has been managing the financial end. They work together quite effectively. Nathaniel put down his fork. He pushed back slightly from the table and looked at the candle at the center, like a man who has just been told something he half knew and had been not knowing deliberately. How long, he said, has Monroe known about this? He received my first letter 3 weeks ago. He's reviewed what I sent him. He'll want to speak with you directly. She paused. He'll want to see the original documents, the ones I've secured. Nathaniel looked at her, then looked at her in a way he hadn't yet fully and with attention. The way you look at something you've been peripheral to and are only now seeing head-on. You secured the documents, he said. Someone had been in that library 2 years ago, a man claiming to be from the county assessor's office. He was alone in the room for 30 minutes. He knew where the survey documents were. I believe his purpose was to establish their location for future use, either to remove them if needed, or to confirm they existed before proceeding with the boundary dispute strategy. And you put them in your room, around my neck initially. She reached into the collar of her dress and produced the key on its chain. The chest in my room is locked. The documents are in oilcloth. No one has accessed them. Nathaniel stared at the key. I was quiet for a long time. Mrs. Ashford, he finally said. Mr. Ashford. Why did you do all of this? It was not quite a question. It was the kind of statement that arrives looking like a question, because the speaker isn't entirely sure they want the answer. Clara set the key back against her collar. Because it needed to be done, she said. And because no one else was doing it. I should have been doing it. Yes. She did not soften it. You should have. The candle between them burned steadily. Outside, a summer night was full and warm, and the windows Clara had opened were letting in the sound of cicadas and the smell of the garden. Nathaniel picked up his fork again. He did not say anything else, but he ate the rest of his supper at his own table in his own dining room, and Clara noticed that he looked once, just once, at the curtains Mrs. Reed had rehung, and at the candlelight on the polished wood, and at the bread Dora had made with pride. She noticed. She did not comment on it. He stayed. Not indefinitely. She understood his Boston business had not ceased to exist, but he did not leave the next morning, or the morning after that. He moved through the house with the careful step of a man relearning a space he thought he had finished with, and Clara watched him do it the way she watched everything, with attention and without comment, letting the information accumulate before she decided what to do with it. He found the east parlor on the second morning, stood in the doorway, looking at the uncovered furniture and the open window and the herbs on the side table, and said nothing for so long that Clara, working at the desk, finally looked up. Is there something you need? She asked. No. He looked at the window. My mother had herbs in here, in pots like that. Samuel's from the kitchen garden. I've been trying to catalog what's surviving in there. I didn't know anything was surviving. 28 apple trees, Clara said. All of them. And the herb beds are coming back if you give them room. He looked at her. Then he walked away. She heard his boots on the stairs. She heard him on the second floor walking the length of the hall, pausing at various points in the way. A man pauses when he's measuring the distance between what he remembers and what he finds. Mrs. Reed came to stand in the parlor doorway. He went upstairs, she said. I heard him. He hasn't been upstairs in this house in 4 years. Not when he came for the accounts. Mrs. Reed's voice was careful. The last time he was upstairs here it was to... She stopped. To close the house after his wife died, Clara finished. Yes. Clara set down her pen. She looked at the ceiling as if she could see through it to wherever Nathaniel was standing in the hall above. "Let him walk," she said. He found the ledger copies on the third day. Clara had left them in the library, organized, labeled, cross-referenced with her journal notes attached in the correct sequence, because she had intended to walk him through them directly and had been waiting for him to indicate he was ready. Instead, he found them himself. She came into the library and found him sitting at the table, with the first ledger open. Not the copy, but the original, and her summary notes beside it, reading with the focused stillness of a man who has just understood that he has been stupid about something for a very long time. She sat down across from him and did not say anything. He read for 20 minutes. She waited. Then he turned to the page where she had documented the Harrow and Associates payments and placed her summary beside it, and he said without looking up, "Walk me through this." She walked him through it. She was precise. She did not editorialize. She presented the numbers and the documents and the sequence of events, the same way she would have presented them to Judge Monroe, with full information and without the inflection of grievance. She was not telling him he had been deceived in order to hurt him. She was telling him because he needed to know, and because the estate, which was breathing again and deserved to keep breathing, required him to know. When she finished, he was quiet. 4 years, he said. Minimum. The earliest irregular payment I can document is 4 years ago, but the acquisition letter is 3 years old, which suggests the relationship predates the formal payment arrangement. They were planning it before the payment started. The payments may have been how they kept the plan moving once they'd established that you were unavailable. He looked at that word. Unavailable. You were grieving, Clara said. They used it. That isn't a failure of your grief, Mr. Ashford. It's a failure of their character. He looked at her. It was the same look from the dinner table, that direct full attention look, but there was something rawer in it this time. You didn't have to do any of this, he said. No, she agreed. I could have sat in the cold bedroom and waited to be retrieved. That didn't seem particularly useful. Most women. I'm not most women. She said it without heat. It was simply a fact. And the house needed someone to look after it. You weren't here, so I was. He looked down at the ledger. I should have been here, he said for the second time. But this time it came out differently. Not as an acknowledgement of failure directed at her. As something he was saying to the room, to the house, to the 7 years of absence he had let accumulate around him like walls. Clara said nothing. She let it sit. Some things needed room to land. The letter from Vivian arrived on the 5th day of Nathaniel's stay, and this time it was not addressed to Clara. It was addressed to Nathaniel. Clara knew this because Mrs. Reed brought the post to the library, where they were both working, and placed it on the table with her usual efficiency, and the letter was clearly on top, clearly in Vivian Harrow's handwriting, clearly addressed to Mr. Nathaniel Ashford, Ashford Hollow. She took her own correspondence and left him to his. She was in the garden when he found her. You've seen Vivian's letters, he said. He was not asking. She wrote to me twice. I've kept them. Clara did not look up from the rose bed. Both are in the journal with the other documents. What did they say? The first was a social introduction, suggesting I direct any questions about the estate to people with longer familiarity with Ashford affairs. The second suggested I keep you informed of my activities. She finally looked up. They were threats in the grammar of social advice. Nathaniel stood with Vivian's letter held loosely at his side. His jaw was tight. What does hers say? Clara asked. If it's relevant to the estate, I need to know. He looked at her for a moment. Then he held it out. She read it standing in the garden with dirt on her gloves. Nathaniel, I understand you've gone to Hollow. I do hope whatever your wife has been filling your head with hasn't alarmed you unduly. You know how new women in a household can mistake ordinary business arrangements for impropriety. It comes from inexperience. I thought it might be useful to speak privately before you take any actions based on incomplete information. I'll be at the Bradford estate in Concord through the end of the month, a short ride. Come when you're ready. V. Clara read it twice, then she handed it back. She doesn't know you've seen the ledgers, she said. She thinks you've only heard my account of them. She thinks I'll take her version over yours. She's been confident of that for 4 years, Clara said. She has reason to be. It's worked before. It was the most direct thing she'd said to him about the 7 years, and she saw it land, saw him absorb it without flinching, which she respected. It won't work this time, he said. No, Clara said. It won't. She turned back to the rose bed. Don't go to Concord, Mr. Ashford. Write to Judge Munro instead. Ask him to come here. He was quiet for a moment. You're not going to ask me why I ever trusted her. That's not my business. Clara. It was the first time he had used her name. Just her name, not her title. She stilled. Ask me, he said. You've earned the right. She turned and looked at him. She thought about it genuinely, thought about whether she wanted to open that particular door, what was behind it, what it would cost both of them to walk through it. After, she said. After Munro comes and the documents are reviewed and the estate is secured. She held his gaze. The estate first. Then we can talk about the rest. He looked at her for a long moment. The garden was warm around them, the apple trees putting out their slow recovered growth along the south wall, the summer full and pressing close. All right, he said. He went inside to write to Munro. Judge Elias Munro arrived 8 days later, and he brought company. Clara had expected the judge. She had not expected the 2 men with him, both attorneys from Boston, both with the measured expressions of men who had reviewed significant documents before arriving and had formed significant opinions about them. Munro himself was 65, white-haired, with the unhurried bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades understanding exactly what people were trying to hide from him. He shook Clara's hand before he shook Nathaniel's, which told her something about what her correspondents had communicated. Mrs. Ashford, he said, your letters were among the most precisely documented communications I've received in 30 years of practice. The numbers made it straightforward, Clara said. The numbers are never straightforward, Munro replied. The skill is in knowing which numbers to read. They spent the first day in the library. Clara laid out everything. Every document, every copied ledger entry, every letter, every note in her journal, in the sequence she had assembled them. She walked Munro and his attorneys through the timeline, the same way she had walked Nathaniel through it, and she watched Munro's face as he read, and she watched his face become very still, in the way that judges' faces become still when they are doing the internal calculus of how serious a thing is. The boundary fence, he said at one point, pulled from 3 sections on the north acreage line. I marked the post positions with field stones before replacing them. The measurements are in that page of the journal. Munro looked at the page. He handed it to one of his attorneys. Survey the line tomorrow, he said, against the 1797 documents. The attorney nodded. The acquisition letter, Munro said. Harrow and Associates Stationery, 3 years old, addressed to a property agent named Clara produced the letter. Munro took it. He read it once and set it down on the table very carefully, the way you set down things that are both fragile and dangerous. This, he said to Nathaniel, is not a misunderstanding. No, Nathaniel said. This is a coordinated effort to deprive you of estate assets through financial manipulation, falsified expense arrangements, and an attempt to establish a boundary dispute for future land acquisition. Munro's voice was precise and without theater. It involves at minimum the Harrow family's business interests and likely 2 or 3 other parties we haven't identified yet. Can it be proven? Clara asked. Munro looked at her with the expression of a man who has just been asked the question he was about to answer. The payments without a contract constitute recoverable funds. The timber receipts below market rate suggest collusion with the buyer. That's a separate thread. The acquisition letter is the most significant piece. He looked at Nathaniel. Do you have any record of authorizing a verbal agreement with Harrow and Associates? No, Nathaniel said. None. Then they have no legal standing for a single payment. Munro closed the journal carefully. We'll want a full accounting. The recovery process will take time. But yes, Mrs. Ashford, it can be proven. Clara sat back. She had been carrying the weight of knowing for 6 weeks, carrying it carefully, carrying it alone through the first weeks, and then with Mrs. Reed, and then with Nathaniel, and now finally with the man who had the legal standing to do something with it. She felt the weight shift. Not disappear, but shift. "There's one more thing," she said. Monroe looked at her. "Vivian Harrow is currently at the Bradford estate in Concord. She wrote to Mr. Ashford 5 days ago suggesting he visit her privately before taking any action based on my accounts of the estate irregularities." Clara produced the letter. "She doesn't know the extent of what we have. I believe she still thinks this can be managed socially." Monroe read the letter. A small tight expression moved across his face that was not quite satisfaction. "She'll find out otherwise," he said. "When she does," Clara said, "she'll move quickly. She's been patient for 4 years. When patience stops working, she won't be patient anymore." Monroe folded the letter. He looked at Clara with the full attention of a man reassessing what he is looking at. "How did you know," he said, "which thread to pull first?" Clara looked at the table full of documents, 6 weeks of work laid out in order, telling the story she had assembled page by careful page from the evidence that had been hiding in plain sight inside this house for years. "I've been managing accounts since I was 16, she said. "My father's business kept its records in the same kind of ledger. I know what honest numbers look like, and I know what numbers look like when someone has arranged them to look honest." She looked at Monroe. The arrangement here was good, but it wasn't good enough for someone who knew what to look for. Monroe nodded slowly. Nathaniel across the table was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. She filed it away. She would think about it later when the estate was secured, and Monroe had what he needed, and the work that had brought her to this table was finished. For now, she closed the journal and placed her hands flat on the cover. "What do you need from me next?" she asked. Monroe smiled, a small, genuine thing. "Everything you've already given me," he said, "and your patience for the days ahead." "I have plenty of patience," Clara said. Across the table she heard Nathaniel exhale a slow, quiet breath, like a man setting down something he had been carrying for a very long time. She did not look at him, but she noticed. Monroe's attorneys spent 2 days surveying the North Acreage line. They came back with measurements that matched Clara's field notes, exactly every stone marker she had placed, every measurement she had recorded in her journal. On the afternoon, Samuel showed her the pulled posts, confirmed to within an inch by professional survey equipment. The 1797 documents were unambiguous. The boundary was not in dispute. It had never been in dispute. Someone had simply wanted it to look like it might be at the right moment, under the right circumstances. Monroe reviewed the survey report at the library table with both attorneys and Nathaniel, and when they were finished, he looked at the stack of evidence Clara had assembled and said quietly to no one in particular, 4 years. "At minimum," Clara said from the doorway. Monroe looked up. He had not heard her come in. "Come sit down, Mrs. Ashford. This concerns you as much as anyone." She sat. "Here is where we stand," Monroe said. He placed his hands flat on the table in the way of a man about to deliver a reckoning. "The payments to Harrow and Associates, uncontracted, undocumented, drawn against estate operating funds, are recoverable, every quarter for 4 years. I've calculated the sum." He slid a page across the table. Nathaniel looked at it. His jaw tightened. Clara looked at it. She had calculated a similar number 3 weeks ago, sitting alone at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning. The figure on Monroe's page was within $40 of her own. "The timber receipts," Monroe continued, "will require a separate investigation. We'll need to identify the buyer and establish whether the below-market pricing was coincidental or coordinated. My belief based on the acquisition letter is coordinated. But belief is not evidence, and we will need evidence." "How long will that take?" Nathaniel asked. "Weeks, possibly longer. The buyer's records will be subpoenaed if they don't cooperate voluntarily." Monroe's expression suggested he did not expect voluntary cooperation. "The acquisition letter itself is the most immediately actionable piece. It demonstrates intent. Combined with the payment irregularities, it establishes a pattern that no Massachusetts court would look at charitably." "Will it be enough to bring charges?" Nathaniel asked. "Against the firm, yes. Against specific individuals within the firm, that depends on what the investigation uncovers." Monroe paused. "I should tell you that Harrow and Associates is not a small operation. They have relationships in Boston society, legal connections, social leverage. This will not be a quiet process. Silence. Clara spoke first. It was never going to be quiet, she said. The moment I wrote to you, it stopped being quiet. Vivian Harrow has already been working to shape the social narrative. She'll accelerate that when she realizes what's happening. She may do more than that, Monroe said, looking at Clara directly. Mrs. Ashford, I want you to understand when this moves forward formally, you will be visible. Your role in uncovering this will not be hidden. There will be people who prefer to characterize your actions as interference, overreach, a new wife causing trouble in affairs she doesn't understand. I understand that, Clara said. It may be uncomfortable. Judge Monroe, Clara said evenly. I was sent to a cold house and told to disappear. I chose not to. I am not afraid of uncomfortable. Monroe looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has taken a full measure of something and found it sufficient. Nathaniel across the table said nothing, but Clara felt him looking at her. The news reached Vivian Harrow on a Thursday. Clara knew this because by Friday morning a letter arrived at Ashford Hollow addressed to Nathaniel, and this time the handwriting was not elegant. It was still Vivian's hand, but the letters pressed harder into the paper, the lines slightly less level than usual. Clara recognized the difference immediately. She had spent 6 weeks reading documents closely enough to know when a writer was composed and when they were not. She left it on the library table for Nathaniel without comment. He read it. He brought it to her in the garden 20 minutes later. Read it, he said. She read it. The letter was 3 pages. The previous 2 had been half a page each. Vivian had moved through social graciousness and was now operating in a different register entirely. She characterized Clara as an inexperienced, socially grasping woman who had manipulated a grieving man's household accounts into a weapon against his oldest friends and business associates. She referred to the Harrow family's decades of relationship with the Ashford estate. She suggested that Nathaniel's judgment had been compromised by an inappropriate dependence on the advice of a woman with a ruined family name and a clear financial motive for destabilizing established arrangements. The last paragraph said, I have always acted in your best interests, Nathaniel. I ask you to remember that and to consider whether the woman currently occupying your house has any interest in you beyond the security your name provides her. Clara finished reading. She handed it back. She's frightened, Clara said. She's attacking you. Same thing at this stage. Clara looked at him. She's trying to make you doubt me before Monroe's investigation gains momentum. If she can separate you from what I've found, the case weakens. You become a grieving widower who was manipulated by an ambitious wife rather than an estate owner who was defrauded by a business associate. She's wrong, Nathaniel said. The words came out hard and immediate. I know that. You know that. Monroe knows that. Clara paused. The question is what you do with the letter. I'm going to write back. Carefully, she said. Clara. He said her name the same way he had in the garden, plain and direct. I know how to handle Vivian Harrow. She looked at him. Do you? He held her gaze. I didn't. I know that. I let her manage my affairs and my narrative and my distance from this house because it was easier than feeling anything about any of it. I understand that now. He set the letter on the potting table beside her. I understand it because you showed me what it looked like from the outside. Clara said nothing for a moment. Write the letter, she said. But send a copy to Monroe first. Nathaniel's response to Vivian was 5 sentences. Clara read it before William posted it. It stated that he had reviewed the estate accounts in full, that he had retained Judge Monroe to investigate the financial irregularities, that he had full confidence in his wife's management of Ashford Hollow during his absence, and that he would not be visiting Concord. The last sentence said, I trust you will understand that I am no longer available for private consultation on matters pertaining to my estate or my household. Clara handed it back to him. That will end the social approach, she said. She'll move to something else. What something else? I don't know yet, but she's not going to accept this quietly. She was right. The something else arrived 9 days later in the form of a social gathering at the Bradford estate in Concord, a late summer afternoon party, to which, as far as Clara could tell, most of notable Boston society had been invited. The guest list, which she learned about through a letter from Monroe's clerk, who moved in those circles, included 3 judges, 2 members of the state legislature, and several of the most influential merchant families in Massachusetts. Nathaniel received his invitation 2 days before the event. Clara received nothing, which was the point. Nathaniel brought the invitation to her directly. He did not pretend he hadn't received it or minimize what it represented. He set it on the library table and said, "She's convening her allies." "Yes," Clara said. "And she's left me off the guest list deliberately to signal that I can be excluded, that I'm not a real Ashford, not an established presence, not someone who needs to be treated as your equal." "What do you want to do?" Clara looked at the invitation. "What are your options?" "I could decline. That confirms I've chosen your account over hers, but it happens privately between her and me, and it gives her room to keep working the social angle." He paused. "Or I could go, alone." "Yes." "And say what?" He was quiet for a moment. "The truth." Clara looked at him. She weighed at the risk of sending him into Vivian's orchestrated environment alone, against the possibility of what he could accomplish there, that no letter, no legal proceeding, no carefully documented ledger could accomplish quite so efficiently. Social damage required social response. Evidence was for courts. But Boston society operated on something more immediate than evidence. "If you go," she said, "you can't be uncertain. Not for a moment, not in front of anyone. The second they see you hesitate, she wins the room." "I won't hesitate." "Nathaniel." She used his name for the first time, and she felt him register it, the same way she had registered it when he'd used hers, that small, precise shift in the air between 2 people. "She's known you for years. She knows where your hesitation lives. She will go directly for it." He looked at her steadily. "Then I need to not have any." She studied him. The set of his jaw, the directness in his eyes. The same directness that had been growing in him over the past 3 weeks as the house opened around him and the accounts laid themselves bare, and the weight of what he'd allowed to happen had settled onto him fully and without softening. He was not the man who had walked out of a church without looking back. She wasn't certain when that had changed. She suspected it had been happening gradually since the first morning she'd watched him stand in the east parlor doorway, looking at the herbs on the table, and she had been noting it the same way she noted everything carefully, without premature conclusion. "All right," she said. "Go." He left for Concord on a Saturday morning. Clara stayed at Ashford Hollow and worked. She did not pace or wait or watch the clock. She spent the morning in the library with Monroe's attorney, who had come out from Boston to continue reviewing the timber receipts, and the afternoon in the garden with Samuel, who had gotten the south wall apple trees shaped well enough that you could see the form they were heading toward, clean-lined and productive, and nothing like the tangle they'd been 60 days prior. Samuel looked at the trees and said with genuine satisfaction, "They'll fruit next summer. Maybe this autumn the strongest ones." "Good," Clara said. She meant it about more than the trees. Mrs. Reed brought tea to the garden at 4 o'clock, which she had never done before. Clara looked at her when she set the tray down. "You're worried about him," Mrs. Reed said by way of explanation. "I'm not worried about Nathaniel," Clara said. "He knows what he's walking into. I wasn't talking about Mr. Ashford." Mrs. Reed poured without being asked. "I was talking about you." Clara accepted the tea. She said nothing. "You've been careful," Mrs. Reed said, sitting down on the bench beside the garden wall, as if she'd been sitting in this garden her whole life, which in a way she had. "Since the first day. You've been very careful not to want anything for yourself out of this." "I've wanted the estate secured." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Clara looked at her tea. "He's a good man," Mrs. Reed said. "He was a good man before grief made him absent. And he's been coming back to himself in this house, and anyone with eyes can see why." A pause. "I'm not a sentimental woman, Mrs. Ashford, but I'm an honest one, and honestly, you're allowed to want something for yourself." Clara set down the teacup. She looked at the apple trees. After, she said. Mrs. Reed made a small sound that might have been exasperation and might have been affection. You and your afters, she said. Nathaniel came back Sunday evening. Clara heard the carriage and was in the library when he came through the door. She did not go to the hall. She heard his boots, heard him hand off his coat, heard him speak briefly to Mrs. Reed in a tone she couldn't parse from this distance. Then his footsteps came down the hall, and he appeared in the library doorway. He looked tired. Not defeated the distinction mattered, and she read it immediately. Tired the way a man looks after a hard thing done correctly. Sit down, she said. He sat across from her. Tell me. He told her. Vivian had staged it carefully. The gathering arranged with the deliberate architecture of a woman who understood social rooms the way Clara understood ledgers. She had positioned her allies, set the tone before he arrived, and spent the first hour of the party allowing the existing narrative to breathe. Poor, Nathaniel troubled marriage, grasping wife unfortunate business confusion. Then, Nathaniel had arrived. He had walked directly to the center of the room, not to Vivian, not to the easiest social cluster, and he had asked for the attention of the room. He had gotten it because he was Nathaniel Ashford, and he had not spoken in a social gathering with this kind of direct intention in 7 years, and people noticed. He told Clara what he'd said, and as she listened, she felt something move in her chest that she had been keeping carefully contained for weeks. He had told the room that his estate had been subjected to 4 years of unauthorized financial extraction by a firm whose principals were present in this gathering. He had told them that Judge Monroe had confirmed the irregularities and that legal proceedings were underway. He had told them that the investigation had been initiated by his wife, who had arrived at Ashford Hollow to find the estate accounts in a condition that should have been caught years earlier, and had not been caught because the people responsible for it had counted on no one looking. And then he had said, Mrs. Ashford looked. She documented everything she found, secured the estate records, contacted the appropriate legal authority, and handled the entire matter with a precision and integrity that I have never seen matched in my 20 years of business. He had looked directly at Vivian when he said the next part. I will not be taking advice on my household or my marriage from anyone who has spent 4 years treating my absence as a financial opportunity. Clara listened to all of it without speaking. When he finished, the library was quiet. What did Vivian do? Clara asked. She left the room. His voice was even. So did her father about 4 minutes later. And the rest of them. Monroe's in court next week. 3 of the men there today will be subpoenaed. They know it. He looked at her. The room changed when I said your name. Not all of it. Some of those people will always prefer the easier story. But enough of it. Clara pressed both hands flat on the table. The journal was under her left palm. The journal that had held 6 weeks of this story that she had been writing in every morning since the 3rd day at Ashford Hollow. You didn't have to do it that way, she said. What way? Publicly, in that room. You could have let Monroe handle it legally and let the social narrative sort itself out gradually. I know, Nathaniel said. So why? Because she called you grasping. His voice shifted, not loud but sudden with feeling, the way a door opens unexpectedly. In a room full of people who were ready to believe it, she called you grasping and ambitious and said the only thing you wanted from my name was security. He looked at her directly. And every person in that room was going to carry that story back to Boston and let it sit there and harden into fact. I wasn't going to let that happen. Clara looked at him. She had made herself a promise on the first day, standing in a cold bedroom in a house she hadn't chosen, that she was not going to want things she couldn't afford to want. She had kept that promise through 6 weeks of early mornings and ledger numbers, and pulled fence posts and legal correspondence and all of it. She had kept it carefully with both hands. But she was looking at Nathaniel Ashford, who had walked into a room full of his own social world, and said her name like it meant something, and she felt the promise flex under the pressure of that. She held it anyway. Thank you, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Don't thank me. He said it directly without softness. I told the truth, that's all. It wasn't all, she said. And you know it. They looked at each other across the library table, with its stacks of carefully documented evidence in the house that was breathing and lit and alive in a way it hadn't been for 7 years. "Clara," he said. "Nathaniel." She said it steadily. "The estate first. That was the agreement." He looked at her. "The estate is in Monroe's hands. The proceedings will take weeks. I'm aware. You have business in Boston. I've sent correspondence." She felt something tighten in her throat. "You're staying?" "Unless you'd prefer I leave." The question sat between them, genuine and unarmored. "No," she said. And then, because she had spent 6 weeks being precise, "I don't prefer you leave." He nodded once, the kind of nod that contains considerably more than nodding. "The dining room," he said after a moment. 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, Clara said. He left the library. She sat still for a moment. Then she opened her journal to a clean page and picked up her pen. She wrote the date at the top. Below it, she wrote the sum Monroe had confirmed as recoverable. Below that, she wrote the status of the timber investigation. Below that, she wrote the survey confirmation. Methodical, sequential, thorough, everything in order, everything documented. At the bottom of the page, she stopped. She looked at what she'd written. Then she wrote in smaller letters, "He stayed." She closed the journal. In the kitchen, she could hear Dora starting supper. In the garden, she could hear Samuel finishing for the day, his footsteps on the stone path she had cleared herself in the 4th week. In the hall, she could hear the grandfather clock, the one that had stopped at 20 past 11, and had stood frozen in that hour for 7 years ticking. Nathaniel had wound it the morning after he arrived. She had not asked him to. He had simply done it. She had not written that down. Some things did not need to go in the journal. Some things were simply true, and you carried them quietly, and you let them be true without needing to document them. She gathered the papers on the table into their proper order, placed them in the correct folders, and went to dress for dinner. The clock ticked in the hall. The house breathed around it. The weeks that followed Nathaniel's return from Concord had a different rhythm than the ones before it. Not easier exactly. The legal proceedings moved at the pace. Legal proceedings always move, which is to say, with the grinding deliberateness of a millstone that cannot be hurried but will eventually reduce everything it touches to a fine and irrefutable powder. Monroe sent correspondence every few days. Subpoenas were issued. The timber buyer's records were requested. 2 of the men who had been in that Concord room sent quiet letters to Monroe's office within the first week, letters that Clara suspected contained the specific kind of information that men offer when they have decided which side of a proceeding they want to be found on when it concludes. But the rhythm inside Ashford Hollow had changed, and that change was the thing Clara felt most acutely in those weeks. Nathaniel ate at the dining table every evening. He worked with William on the carriage axle that had been riding rough since before Clara arrived. He spent a morning with Samuel in the North Acreage, walking the boundary line, looking at the timber stands with the eyes of a man who was actually seeing them, instead of letting them exist vaguely at the edge of his awareness. He came back from that morning quieter than he'd left, and Clara did not ask what he'd thought about, but she saw the set of his jaw and understood that he was reckoning with 7 years in the way that men reckon when they have finally stopped looking away. He wound the clock every morning. She noticed that too. One evening about 2 weeks after Concord, she came downstairs late past 10, which was unusual for her because she had been writing in her journal and lost track of time. The library was dark. The hall was quiet, but light came from under the parlor door. She pushed it open. Nathaniel was sitting in the chair by the window with a book open in his lap that he was not reading. He looked up when she came in. "You're awake late," he said. "Journal," she said. "I lost track." He looked at the book he wasn't reading. "I couldn't sleep." She sat down across from him. Not because she had planned to, but because it was late, and she was tired, and it was her parlor, and his company had stopped feeling like something she needed to manage. She tucked her feet under her in the chair, something she would not have done at the dining table, something that was simply a person, being a person, late at night in a room where the formality had worn off. He watched her do it, and said nothing. "The timber case," he said after a moment. "Monroe's clerk wrote yesterday. The buyer's records show a fixed-price arrangement going back 5 years, 1 year before the Harrow payment started. They built the whole thing in sequence, he said. Yes, first the buyer relationship that establishes the below-market receipts, then the management fee that creates the paper drain on operating funds, then the assessor visit that catalogs the documents, then the fence posts that was going to be the last stage, the boundary dispute, which would have given them legal standing to challenge the North acreage acquisition price when the estate was finally distressed enough to sell. If I'd never come back, if you'd stayed away another 2 years, Monroe thinks the estate would have been distressed enough. The operating fund shortfall alone would have required either a sale of assets or borrowing. Either way, Harrow would have been positioned. Nathaniel was quiet. I almost didn't come back, he said. When your letter arrived in Boston, my first instinct was to send an agent. Clara looked at him. Why didn't you? He thought about it. Something in how you'd written it. You didn't ask me to come. You informed me of what you'd found and told me what you intended to do about it, and at the end you said Monroe's office was available to receive my authorization. He paused. You wrote to me the same way you would have written to anyone with a legal interest in the estate. Not like a wife writing to a husband. That's what the situation required. I know. That's why I came. He looked at her. I'd spent 3 months having people write to me the way they thought I wanted to be written to. And then you wrote to me the way the situation required, and it was... He stopped. It woke something up. Clara held very still. I'm not good at this, he said. Not apologetically, just directly, the same directness she'd been watching develop in him since the day he'd walked through the front door and seen the open shutters. I was. Before. I knew how to be present in my own life. And then Eleanor died, and I left. Not the house. Myself. And I stayed gone long enough that I nearly lost everything she and I had built together because I was too buried in grief to notice what was happening around me. Clara said nothing. She let him have the space to say it. She would have hated it, he said. She would have been furious with me. Eleanor had no patience for absence. She believed you showed up or you didn't, and if you didn't, you had no right to the things that required showing up. He looked at the book in his lap. You reminded me of her when I first came back. Not in look or manner. He considered. In the refusal to disappear. Clara felt something move through her, complicated and quiet. I'm not Eleanor, she said. No, he said immediately. I know that. I'm not confusing you. I want to be clear about that. He looked at her directly. You're entirely yourself. That's what I mean. She was entirely herself, and you're entirely yourself, and I had forgotten what that looked like. What it felt like to be in a room with someone who is entirely, stubbornly, uncomplicatedly themselves. The fire had burned low. The parlor was warm and quiet, and the clock in the hall ticked its steady, recovered tick. Nathaniel, she said. I know, he said. The estate first. The estate is nearly settled. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, that particular shift she had been filing away for weeks, the one she hadn't named yet. She was naming it now. Nearly, he said. Give Monroe 2 more weeks, she said. Let the proceedings reach a stable point. Let the recovery be confirmed. And then... She held his gaze. And then we can talk about the rest. He nodded. The clock ticked. Neither of them moved to leave. They sat in the parlor until past midnight, talking not about the estate, not about the accounts, not about Vivian or Monroe, or the North acreage line. They talked about his mother who had planted the herb garden. They talked about Clara's father, who had taught her double-entry bookkeeping at a kitchen table in Boston when she was 12, and called it the most honest language in the world, because numbers could not be made to mean something they didn't. They talked about Eleanor without pain, or rather with a pain that had been properly placed, set down in the correct corner of the room where it belonged, rather than spread across everything. They talked about the apple trees and Samuel, and the way Dora's bread had gotten better since someone had started telling her it was good. They talked until the fire was nothing but coals, and then they said goodnight and went upstairs, and Clara lay in her room in the dark, with her hands folded, and felt for the first time since arriving at Ashford Hollow that she was not managing a situation. She was living in one. Monroe's formal findings arrived on a Tuesday morning 14 days later, almost to the hour. The document was 31 pages. Clara read every one of them at the library table, while Nathaniel sat across from her, reading his own copy. And the house was so quiet, she could hear the apple leaves moving outside the window and the sound of her own steady breathing. The findings confirmed every number she had calculated. They confirmed the uncontracted payments, the below-market timber sales, the coordinated acquisition strategy, and the assessor's office. Visit the man who had come 2 years prior turned out not to be from the assessor's office at all, which surprised no one. The total sum of recoverable funds was significant. The legal exposure for the Harrow family's business interests was, in Monroe's careful legal language, substantial. There was one more thing in the document that Clara had not expected. On page 22, Monroe had included a formal finding regarding the role of estate management in the investigation. It was a paragraph precise and unembellished in the way Monroe wrote everything, stating that the irregularities had been identified and documented by Mrs. Clara Ashford, who had assumed management of the household accounts upon her arrival at the estate, and whose meticulous records had formed the evidentiary foundation of the entire proceeding. She read the paragraph twice. She looked up and found Nathaniel watching her. "Page 22, she said. "I read it," he said. "He didn't need to include that. He included it because it's true, and because it belonged in the record." Nathaniel set his copy down. "Monroe is a precise man. He documents what happened. What happened is that you found it." Clara looked back at the page. She thought about the third morning at Ashford Hollow, when she had sat at the kitchen table before sunrise with a lamp and a ledger, and a feeling that something in the numbers was wrong. She thought about the letter in the linen cupboard and the fence posts pulled from the north line, and Gerald Pratt's smile that didn't reach his eyes, and Vivian's first letter in its gracious blade tone. She thought about Monroe's clerk writing worthy of review, and what it had felt like to read those 2 words after weeks of working entirely alone. She had not expected anyone to put her name in a formal legal document. She had not been working toward that. She had been working toward the estate being safe, and the truth being known, and the house, her house, she thought it clearly and without apology, now being what it deserved to be. But Monroe had put her name in the record, and it was there now, permanent in the kind of document that got filed and kept and referenced, and she felt the weight of that in a way she had not anticipated. "Clara," Nathaniel said. She looked up. "Come here," he said. It was not a command. It was an ask, quiet and direct, from a man who had learned over the past weeks the difference between the two. She stood. She walked around the table. He stood too, and they were close. Close in the way that two people who have been in the same house for 2 months, carefully maintaining the appropriate distance, are suddenly close when the careful part stops being necessary. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You've apologized, not properly." He looked at her steadily. "I married you and sent you away and called it done. I gave you a cold house and empty rooms, and a letter with 3 sentences and no signature. I left you alone with a household full of strangers and an estate someone was actively stealing from, and I stayed in Boston and let myself believe that distance was the same as dealing with things." His voice was even, but she could hear what was underneath it, the specific quality of a man holding himself accountable without flinching. "That was wrong. It was wrong before you found the accounts, and wrong before Monroe, and wrong before Concord. It was wrong the day I walked out of that church." "Yes," she said. "It was." He did not wince at the confirmation. She had known he wouldn't. That was one of the things she had learned about him. "I can't undo it," he said. "No. But I can show up from here." She looked at him. Really looked, the full attention look she gave to things that mattered. She looked at the man who had wound the clock every morning, who had walked the North Acreage boundary with Samuel, who had spoken her name in a room full of people who were waiting to dismiss her. "Showing up," she said, "is the whole of it. That's all it ever is." He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically. Not with the theater of a man making a declaration. Simply took her hand, and the way you take the hand of someone you have decided you are not going to let go of. She let him. The news of the Harrow proceedings broke properly in Boston society the following week, and it broke the way Monroe had warned it would not, quietly. The formal filing generated, Exactly the kind of attention that formal filings generate when they involve well-known names and significant sums of money, and a pattern of conduct that retroactively reframes 4 years of social narrative. The people who had heard Nathaniel's statement at Concord understood now what they had been watching. The people who had not been there read the summary that circulated through the better households within 48 hours of the filing and understood it too. Vivian Harrow left Boston. Clara learned this from Monroe's clerk, who included it almost as an aside at the end of a letter about the recovery timeline. Miss Harrow has relocated to her aunt's estate in Connecticut. Her father has retained separate counsel. 8 words about a woman who had spent 4 years building a careful, patient architecture of control, reduced to a forwarding address. Clara did not feel triumph about this. She examined herself for it because she thought it was the kind of moment where triumph was a natural response, and found instead something quieter, a settled completeness, the feeling of a column of numbers that has been added correctly and come out right. She told Nathaniel at dinner. He nodded once. Her father will likely settle before it goes to full trial, he said. Monroe thinks so too. Does that bother you? I thought about it honestly, which was something she had come to expect from him. It would have bothered me more 6 months ago, he said, when I still thought of the Harrow family as people I had a relationship with. Now it's just resolution. Justice doesn't always look like what we imagine, Clara said. No. He looked at her across the dinner table. Sometimes it looks like a woman at a kitchen table at 6 in the morning with a lamp and a ledger. She looked at him. That's a very specific image. Mrs. Reed told me, he said. She said that was the image she was going to carry from this whole business. You alone before anyone else was awake, finding what everyone else had missed. Clara thought about those mornings. The lamp, and the quiet, and the numbers, and the particular quality of certainty that comes when you know you are right, but cannot yet prove it. I wasn't doing it to be seen, she said. I know, Nathaniel said. That's why it matters. September came to Ashford Hollow, with the particular fullness of late New England summer, moving toward autumn, warm days and cool nights, and the smell of the turning season in everything. The apple trees along the south wall were doing what Samuel had predicted. Not all of them. The recovery was uneven, as recoveries tend to be, but 11 of the 28 had set fruit. Small early fruit, not the full yield they would produce in coming years, but real and present and growing on branches that 6 months ago had been so tangled in neglect that Clara had not been certain they could be saved. She stood in the garden on a Thursday morning and looked at those 11 trees. She heard Nathaniel come through the garden gate behind her. She knew his step now, the particular weight and rhythm of it, the way it differed from Samuel's and William's and every other set of footsteps in the house. She had known everyone's step within the first 2 weeks. That was simply how she moved through the world with attention, with the steady accumulation of detail that other people let pass by. He came to stand beside her. 11, she said. Samuel told me. He seemed pleased about it. He should be. He did most of the work. He said you told him which branches to cut and which to keep. I read about it. She paused. My father had a book on orchard management. He bought it when he thought he might buy land upstate. He never did, but I read the book. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Your father. How was a good man who made a bad investment and lost nearly everything and spent the last 5 years of his life trying to manage the gap between what he'd had and what he had left. She said it without self-pity, simply as fact as she said most things. He taught me the accounts because he said a woman who understood numbers would never be entirely without resources. He was right. He sounds like he was someone worth knowing. How was? She looked at the trees. He would have liked this house. Nathaniel said quietly, I'm glad you're in it. She turned and looked at him. The morning was clear and warm, and the garden was full of everything they had put into it, and he was looking at her with that expression she had named weeks ago, and had been carrying carefully since. I wrote to my sister last week, she said. In Philadelphia. I told her I was staying. You hadn't told her before? I hadn't decided before. She met his eyes. I've decided now. He looked at her for a long moment. Clara, I need to tell you something. All right. When I came back to this house, I told myself I was coming for the estate. The accounts, the legal situation, the irregularities you documented. He paused. That was true. But it stopped being the whole truth somewhere around the third day when I walked into the East Parlor and found you at the desk, and you didn't look up or adjust yourself or perform anything. You just said, "Is there something you need?" and went back to work. She remembered it exactly. I thought, he said, there is a person who is entirely at home in herself. In my house, in a situation she didn't choose managing things. She had no obligation to manage, and she is entirely at home in herself. He looked at her hands. I have not been at home in myself for 7 years. And I watched you be that every day, and it pulled me back. Clara said nothing for a moment. She was a person who did not speak before she was ready, and she needed to be ready for this. Nathaniel, she said. I came here with one trunk and a piece of paper listing my legal rights as a married woman under Massachusetts statute, because I needed to know what I had and what I didn't. She looked at him directly. I didn't have warmth. I didn't have welcome. I didn't have a husband who looked at me, or a house that was alive, or a single reason to believe this was going to be anything other than what it looked like. A cold arrangement between two people who needed something from each other and called it a marriage. I know, he said. But I stayed, she said. Not because I had no choice. I had choices. I could have written to Monroe myself and handled the legal matter through correspondence and lived in this house as a competent stranger and called that sufficient. She held his gaze. I stayed because somewhere in the second week I looked at this house and thought, this is worth saving. And somewhere in the fourth week I looked at you and thought the same thing. He exhaled that same slow breath she had heard in the library after Monroe said, it can be proven the breath of a man setting down a weight. I don't know how to be someone's husband the way it ought to be done, he said. I knew once. I've been away from it long enough that I'm not certain the knowledge is still where I left it. You wound the clock, she said. He looked at her. What? Every morning. Since the first day you arrived, you wound the grandfather clock. 7 years it stood at 11:20, and you came back and you wound it. She looked at him steadily. That's how I knew. He stared at her. Knew what? That you were coming back to yourself. She said it quietly, with the same precision she brought to everything. Not the clock. That you were capable of noticing a stopped thing and doing the small work of starting it again. That's the whole skill, Nathaniel. That's all love ever is, noticing what's stopped and doing the daily work of keeping it going. He reached out and took her face in his hands. Not with urgency, not with the drama of a man who has been waiting and can wait no longer. With deliberateness. With the full present tense attention of a man who has finally completely shown up. I'm going to do it right this time, he said. I know, she said. I'm going to hold you to it. He kissed her in the garden with 11 apple trees putting out their first recovered fruit along the south wall, and the house breathing behind them with every window open, and the clock ticking in the hall, and the morning full and clear and entirely present around them both. The legal settlement came through in October. Monroe's letter was characteristically brief and precise. Full recovery of the unauthorized payments, a separate civil judgment on the timber receipts. The acquisition letter formally entered into the public record of the proceedings, and the Harrow family's legal exposure resolved through a settlement that Monroe described as appropriately substantial. He included a final note at the bottom of the letter after his signature. That was the most informal thing Clara had ever seen him write. The estate records of Ashford Hollow are now among the most thoroughly documented in 3 counties. Should you ever find yourself without occupation, the legal profession would welcome your particular skills. Clara laughed, genuinely fully the way she had not laughed in a long time. Nathaniel looked at her from across the breakfast table. Monroe, she said, and handed him the letter. He read the postscript. Something moved across his face, not the careful, almost smile she had catalogued in the first weeks, but an actual unguarded smile that changed his whole face into something she had suspected was under there and was glad to finally see. He's not wrong, Nathaniel said. I have sufficient occupation, Clara said. Do you? He set the letter down. What would you say your occupation is precisely? She looked around the kitchen at Dora, moving efficiently at the stove, at the garden, visible through the window, where Samuel was already working, at the sound of William in the stable yard, and Mrs. Reed's footsteps on the floor above. At the clock in the hall. At the man across the table who had wound it this morning, as he wound it every morning, and who would wind it tomorrow. "I'm the woman who keeps Ashford Hollow running," she said. "That's one way to put it." "What's another?" He looked at her with that full attention look she had first catalogued in the East Parlor on day 3, and had been accumulating evidence about ever since. "Home," he said. "You're the reason this place is home." Clara picked up her coffee. She held his gaze over the rim. "We both are," she said. "That's the point." Outside, the October morning was turning the apple leaves gold along the south wall, and the house that had been cold and sealed and silent for 7 years was full of the ordinary, irreplaceable sounds of people who had chosen each other and chosen this place and intended to stay. And every window was open, and the light came through, and the clock in the hall kept perfect time. Ashford Hollow was not a cold estate given to an unwanted wife. It was a home that 2 people had built back from the bones up, one window at a time, one true account at a time, one wound clock and one recovered tree, and one honest word at a time. And it would remain a home for every year that came after, because the people inside it had learned at some cost, and with full clarity, that love is not a feeling that arrives and stays on its own.